But, but starting in the early 1980s, we saw development rising, okay? And it continued to rise until it peaked at an annual rate of over 2 million acres in 1997, at which point it started to come down. And it ended up falling quite dramatically to 2015, in 2015, to a level that represents less than a quarter of what it was at its peak. Okay, and so this trend really kind of strikes a lot of people as being surprising. And as you know, as concise a summary as possible of our paper is really to just kind of figure out what's going on here, to kind of unpack this trend in different ways. Think about how widespread it was, what might have caused it, so on and so forth. But so to kind of start with, you know, maybe an obvious kind of rhetorical question, why should we care about this trend? Why might it matter for land managers, conservation agencies, and practitioners? So for one, the US, in particular, the Eastern US, has really been a global hotspot for the conversion of forest land to developed uses. In addition, as far as forest land goes, conversion to developed uses is the #1 source of US forest loss. And these are important changes largely because they're generally irreversible. So you don't see a lot of houses getting torn down to allow timber stands to grow back. Now, you know, to some extent, of course, land development is kind of a natural byproduct of economic growth. But there are also a host of potential negative effects that can come along with it. Okay, so we're talking about things like the loss of productive farmland and forest land and the outputs that come along with that land, ecosystem service degradation, things like water quality can be affected, carbon sequestration potential, wildlife habitat, other amenities that people value. And then when we think about low density development in particular, or urban sprawl, which is kind of a loosely defined term, but there are also a bunch of additional challenges that can come up here. You know, increased reliance on cars, leading to more air pollution, for instance, people living more sedentary lifestyles, leading to higher obesity rates, and so on and so forth. So these are kind of some of the reasons why so many people are interested in what happens to forest and agricultural land in terms of development. And so from a policy standpoint, most land conservation policy is usually motivated by safeguarding in some way forest and agricultural lands from development. Now, in terms of where we fit in to this, you know, broad array of prior work on this issue, we can think about much of the past work being what I would refer to as retrospective analysis of previously enacted policies, or ex post analysis. So these include things like protected area designation, payments for ecosystem services schemes, urban growth boundaries, which are a mainstay of the land use planning program in Oregon, subsidies for specific uses, and then preferential tax treatment, use value assessment, which is also kind of a major component of my work. There have also been some studies that have taken kind of more of a forward-looking approach and looked at how land development might play out in the future under alternative policy scenarios. And so rather than look at a specific policy or suite of policies, in this paper, what we do is we take kind of a retrospective approach and analyze this large shift in land development, think about what it means from kind of a land conservation standpoint, and then analyze some of the potential drivers that may have spurred this large decline in the annual rate of land development. And so in terms of our specific research questions, first, what happened, right? What are we interested in here? So as I showed you before, we're really keying in on this major fall in the annual rate of land development that's occurred since the 1990s. And as I'll show you in a minute, this was really fairly widespread. It happened across the US for various land uses, various ways of kind of stratifying the US land base. So what does this mean? What are the consequences of this shift? So the main finding here is that because of this shift in the likelihood of land development, we were spared approximately 7 million acres of avoided development on forest and agricultural lands. The bulk of this was forest land, so slightly more than half was forest land. So that's a fairly substantial difference. Okay, and then why did it happen? So here we look at three major drivers of urbanization, and we tend to find that higher commuting costs appear to explain more than kind of stagnant median income growth or population changes, which I'll show were fairly linear in explaining this declining land development trend. So in terms of our data source here, we use a data set from the USDA NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We use their National Resources Inventory, or NRI, data set. So this is a plot level data set that gives us a longitudinal measure at the plot level of land use for the years I'm listing here. And you can kind of see the sporadic 5-year intervals and then 3-year intervals for those earlier years. And then it's available annually from 2000 to 2015. And importantly, for our purposes, these data, they are meant for analyzing land use change. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. We have the plot level data. We have kind of a restricted version of it where we have the plot level information, but we only know the county with which each plot is located, in which each plot is located. And our focus here is on the NRI categories of urban and built up land. So this includes both small and large built up areas. And so the main inspiration for our paper really came from this figure here, which is included in the 2017, was also included in the earlier version, NRI summary report. Okay, and so this shows the same thing that I showed you earlier in the annual trend, but using 5-year groupings, okay, of the NRI data. And you can see here that it shows the same thing, right? Development was rising and then falling. And here we're also seeing that the pattern was really quite consistent across all major categories of undeveloped land. So that's forest, cropland, pasture, and range, right? They all kind of show the same general trajectory. And so before I kind of get into our own results here, I want to hopefully, I want to flag and hopefully clear up a couple of concerns that may be popping into your minds. So first, why aren't we using satellite data? Why aren't we using something like the National Land Cover data set that's really popular in kind of land use land cover studies? Okay, so here, the best NLCD product available for studying land cover change only allows us to look at changes from 2001 to 2019. So that kind of rules out us being able to say anything about this earlier period where development was rising. Conceptually, and I think more importantly, it's important to note that land cover and land use are not necessarily the same thing, right? And so the NLCD has been shown to systematically undercount things like exurban development, especially in heavily wooded areas where there may be a house there, but it's not going to be picked up in kind of the remote sensing data process because of the tree cover overlying the house, right? So that's a really important reason behind why we're going with the NRI, which again provides more of a pure measure of land use. With that said, though, Colin Homer and some of his co-authors who kind of run the NLCP program, in a recent paper, they do kind of point to a similar post-2000 pattern of development as what we find with the NRI, where it tends to come down since 2001 in this case. And there are other papers, other data sources that kind of point to more or less the same thing. We're really the first ones to kind of dig in and figure out what's going on with this pattern. But you know, suffice to say, the pattern of declining development that we find with the NRI is not due to some weird, you know, quirk in that particular data set. And so the second thing I just want to briefly touch on is that when I talk about land development here, this is different than housing starts or housing construction, right? So I'm plotting our land development trend in the top part of the figure. And then below, we have housing starts over the same time period. Okay, and there's certainly some connection between housing construction and land development. Usually need to develop land in order to build houses on it, of course. But housing starts in and of itself really misses kind of the density component. So from, you know, an environmental standpoint, what's often of more interest is how much forest and agricultural land are you losing in order to build a certain number of houses. And then another thing I just want to touch on here is that what we're looking at is a broader change that occurred outside the scope of the housing crisis that kind of preceded the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, right? So you can see land development was coming down before the housing crisis, which I've outlined here in gray, okay? And then it continued afterwards, right? So there's certainly some, you know, it's certainly part of the story here, but this is not the only thing that we're looking at. This is not just an analysis of the housing crisis, in other words. And so now I'm going to get into some of our main descriptive results here. And so again, I'm plotting for the third time now that annual trend in land development. Again, this covers the entire conterminous US. And then on the right-hand side of the figure, I'm plotting the aggregate or total developed land trend. You can see kind of the curvature here, kind of the concave shape it takes, which is consistent with this declining marginal increase in new development. And then I'm also plotting population growth, or total population over the same period. Okay, and so the thing I want you to take away here is that this trend in development occurred despite relatively constant population growth, right? So we haven't seen a slowdown in population growth to the same extent that we've seen this slowdown in land development. Now, thinking about this a little bit more from a density perspective, the figure here, the top one, takes that total population in each year and divides it by the total area of developed land. Okay, and so you can see early on throughout the 80s and 90s, okay, developed areas were becoming less dense, right? We were fitting fewer and fewer people onto each acre of developed land. Okay, but since around 2000, that's really flatlined, right? And it's actually started to go up a little bit. And that's due to the fact that if we look at the annual change ratio in each of these variables, you'll see that population growth has started to dramatically outpace new land development in virtually every year since 2015. Since 2000 out to 2015. Okay, so that's what's causing this slowdown in developed areas becoming less dense. And so now what I want to do is just give you a sense of how widespread this phenomenon was, this densification phenomenon. So the map here is showing at the state level the difference between the change in density between 2000 and 2015 and the change in density between 1982 and 2000. Okay, so bluer states here indicate states that got denser over this more recent period. And so the main takeaway is that all states but one, Nevada, got denser over this more recent period relative to the earlier period. Okay, so Nevada is the only one at the state level that doesn't show this pattern. If we looked at this at the county level, we'd see kind of more or less the same thing with just kind of a hodgepodge of different colors that I didn't want to show here. But roughly 90% of counties in the lower 48 that collectively cover more than 83% of the total population also got denser over this more recent period. Okay, so this was a fairly widespread phenomenon. And now what I want to do is kind of disaggregate this trend in various ways, this land development trend, by kind of stratifying the US land base in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of figures now that kind of look more or less the same, and that's kind of the point, but I'll try to make sure I walk you through what each one is showing. So first, let's look at regions. Let's look at a regional breakdown. And so you can see that development really took off in the Southeast and Northeast/Midwest regions. And that's also where land development came down the most in this more recent period. Other regions, the Pacific Coast and the Rocky Mountains / Great Plains, there we saw less development overall. Again, this is in acreage terms. Less development overall, but they kind of follow a similar pattern of increasing and then declining development. Now I'm going to break things down by the distribution of baseline 1980s, this predates our study period, population density. Okay, here, the densest quartile of counties, so these are the 25% of counties that were the densest in 1980. That's where we saw the most development, but then that's also where we saw a dramatic decline. Okay, and again, similar patterns just at lower levels of development throughout the population density distribution. Now doing the same thing, but looking at baseline commuting time, and I'll explain a little bit later where commuting costs fit into our story. But here, the top 3 quartiles of commuting time all show very similar patterns. And then the lowest quartile, so these are counties with very low commute times, generally pretty rural areas where there's not a lot of development to begin with. It's a lot flatter there, but again, kind of shows this similar pattern. And then doing the same thing for household income. Here, the highest income counties did and still do see the most development. And then it kind of follows an ordinal pattern here, going across the household income distribution with all quartiles showing more or less the same, a similar pattern. Okay, and then the last one in this section is where I'm going to break things down by pre-existing use. Okay, so the use prior to when the land was developed. And so what's probably most interesting to this audience is the fact that forest land was and continues to be the most common source of new development in the US. That's where development really took off the most. And it's also, though, where development came down the most. Okay, cropland, that's the second most source of new development, second most common source of new development. And then we have forest, pasture and range, which show again a similar pattern, but just less pronounced due to the fact that development tends to be less common on those types of lands. Right, so this is really, the main takeaway from this kind of section of the presentation and paper is that this was really a remarkably consistent trend, right? It occurred across various different areas, various different types of counties throughout the US, where the main difference is really just in the level of development that's occurring as opposed to the shape of the trajectory of land development, again, from the 1980s, the early 1980s through 2015. Okay, so that's kind of it for the what happened part of the paper. Next, I'm going to take a look at what what the implications were from kind of a land conservation perspective. Okay, what were the implications for the stock of forest and agricultural lands of this shift in land development? So to do this, I'm going to conduct and show you the results from a simple counterfactual simulation where, starting with that earlier period where development was rising, we compute a set of land use transition probabilities that account for all possible land use changes. Okay, so all of the different types of development, crop to pasture, crop to forest, forest to crop, so on and so forth. And we're going to do this at the county level. Okay, then we're going to take the landscape in 2000 and assume that those transition probabilities were held fixed at their levels from this earlier period. Okay, we then simulate a set of counterfactual land use changes focusing on development here using those 1982 to 1997 transition probabilities. Okay, and this allows us to compare the actual land use changes that occurred from 2000 to 2015 with those simulated changes based on our assumption that the transition probabilities didn't change, right? So this gives us a sense of, how much land development was avoided by this shift in the likelihood of land being developed. Where was it avoided? What types of land were spared the most from development by this change? And so the upshot here is that if those development rates had persisted from the 80s and 90s, we would have lost an additional 7.1 million acres of forest and agricultural land. Okay, so that's a non-trivial change. That's a substantial difference, represents 36% over what actually occurred. Okay, and most of this land that was spared, as I mentioned earlier, was forest land. Okay, so that was slightly more than half. And so if we look at kind of just a broad regional breakdown here, you can see that the Northeast and Midwest, these were the regions, this was the region rather, that saw the largest amount of total avoided development in acreage terms. On a percentage basis, it was actually the Pacific Coast at 52%. The Southeast also saw a fairly large amount of avoided development. And then the Rockies, Great Plains region, that's where we saw the smallest change, right? So only a roughly 9% difference relative to a difference of at least 30% in all of the other regions. Okay, and then just taking, giving you a sense of the geographic distribution here at kind of a finer scale. Here, bluer means more avoided land development. So you can see that California, Pennsylvania, and then a bunch of states in the eastern southeast region is where that avoided development was most concentrated. The beige colored states here, these are states where we actually would have seen less development had those earlier transition probabilities continued, right? There's actually less development in the earlier period relative to the more recent period. Okay, so these are kind of found throughout the Rockies and Great Plains region, as well as kind of the western half of the Southeast. So Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, as well as Delaware. And so now what I'm gonna do is take a sip of water. But now what I'm gonna do is present our analysis on the drivers of this change, right? We're gonna estimate a statistical model that's gonna link 3 key drivers of urbanization to these changes in land development that we've been discussing so far. So the 3 drivers we focus on are population growth. So intuitively, as population grows, people need more land for housing, businesses, commercial and industrial buildings, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's kind of an obvious positive linkage there. Income, so as people get richer, they generally want bigger houses on bigger lots. Okay, so there's kind of a positive connection there as well. And then commuting costs. And so for commuting costs, as commuting costs rise, we would expect the density of an urban area to be constrained, right? People aren't going to want to live, further away into kind of the exurbs when commuting costs are higher, because it's going to take them a lot more, it's going to take up a lot more of their budget to commute to their job every day, right? So we'd expect as commuting costs rise for land development to come down. And so I showed you already the overall trend for population. Now I'm just going to do the same for income. This is median household income and gas prices, which are a major component of our commuting cost measure. So during this earlier period, when development was rising, we also saw rising income. Okay, at the same time, gas prices were tending to fall. Okay, so people were getting richer and it was costing them less in order for them to commute to their place of work, right? And that's when we saw development rising. Now, starting around 2000 or the late 1990s, income growth kind of stagnated, right? It's pretty flat. And then gas prices generally were on the rise. So people now weren't getting any richer, and it was costing them more and more to commute, per mile of travel to their place of work. So this kind of foreshadows our statistical results, which I'll kind of describe in more detail now. And I promise this is the only equation I'm going to show you. This is probably the longest I've gone in a presentation without showing an equation. So it's no small accomplishment for me, but I'll walk you through what the different pieces represent here in our econometric model. Okay, so the dependent variable here is the inverse hyperbolic sine of the change in developed acres over the previous year at the county level. Okay, don't be scared by this term here, this inverse hyperbolic sine. This is just a way for us to look at percentage-based effects of these variables on the right-hand side, while still accounting for the fact that we can have a zero, right? It's a perfectly legitimate for a county, especially a rural county, to have zero development in a given year. So this just allows us to do the same thing that a natural log would, but allows us to account for zeros. PG, this is population growth over the previous year. I, this is median household income. Okay, again at the county level. Okay, P superscript G, this is the average price of gas at the state level, okay, where the county is located. And so we only have variation in gas prices at the state level. And this is kind of probably the most important margin of variation anyway, due to the large role that state gas taxes play in determining the price that you pay at the pump. But to allow for some county level variation in the effect of state level gas prices, we also include an interaction with the average commuting time at the county level. So we let the effect of gas prices vary by how long on average it takes for people to commute to their place of work. J, this is included in these right-hand side terms here. And this is just a lag. Okay, so we're looking at the effects of these variables prior to when development actually occurs. We use a 2-year lag as our preferred specification. The results really don't change very much at all if we use 1 or 3. Okay, we also include state-specific time trends. So these are going to pick up state linear variations in things like land use regulations or conservation policies. We include time or year fixed effects. These are going to absorb things that change over time and affect all counties in sort of a similar way. Things like interest rate changes, recessions, and so on. And then alpha, these are going to be our county fixed effects. So these are going to pick up and absorb things that vary across counties but don't change over time. So think things like topographic features that may in some way restrict the feasible area of development within a county, mountains, for instance, climate, which is generally not something that changes on a year-to-year basis, or by definition is something that doesn't change on a year-to-year basis. Soil quality, things of that sort. Okay, and so here are our major or main estimation results. I'm going to quickly walk through these and then put these numbers in a more easy to interpret format in the next slide. So in general, what we find is that there's a positive association between population change and development. Okay, there's a positive association between income change and land development. Gas prices have a negative effect that's not statistically significant, but really starts to pop out when we include that interaction with commuting time. So the effect of gas prices, in other words, really depends on how long the average commute is within a county. And so I'm going to put these estimates now kind of in the context of that declining land development trend that I've been talking about throughout the talk. So for each entry here, I'm just going to walk you through this first. We have the percentage effect of the variable at the top. Beneath that, in parentheses, we have the standard error. And then beneath that, in square brackets, we have the annual change or the average change that was used to compute the percentage effect. Okay, so for instance, in the early period, we do this separately for that earlier period when development was rising and the later period where development's falling. In that earlier period, there was on average an 890 person per year change in population. And that had the effect of boosting development by about 0.63%. Okay, in the later period, the average population change was 820 people per year. And that had a similar effect of boosting development by about 0.6%, 0.58% per year. Right, so population growth, again, was fairly linear, fairly constant over this time period. So it's not surprising that population change has a similar effect in the earlier and later part of the study period. Now looking at income, during that early period, on average, we had a $670 average rise in median household income. That had the effect of boosting development by just over 3%. Now, during that more recent period, we actually had an average annual change in household income of about negative $20. Okay, and that had a small negative effect on land development of about 0.1% per year, so pretty small. Then looking at gas prices, okay, so these effects here I'm showing at the average commuting time, and then I'll show you the effects across the distribution of commuting time next. But during that period when development was rising, we saw a negative 5 cent per year average decrease in gas prices. And that had the effect of boosting development by about 6%. Okay, and then during that more recent period, we had an average gas price change of 3 cents per year. And that had the effect of decreasing development by about 2.8% per year. Okay, so this is where our main result comes from, that changes in commuting cost really seem to explain more than changes in income or population in explaining this declining land development phenomenon. Okay, and so now what I'm doing is I'm just going to show you the gas price effects across the distribution of commuting time. Okay, so during, again, this earlier period, development's rising, we find that the effect of gas prices was largest in the longest commute areas. Okay, so when gas prices decrease, it's those areas that are going to see the biggest savings overall in terms of how much, in relative terms, it takes people to spend in order to commute to their place of work. Now, during the more recent period, when development was falling, okay, we find that rise in gas prices corresponded with the biggest reduction in development in the longest commuting counties. Okay, so again, that's where we would expect for people to have to fork over a bigger chunk of their wallet in order to commute to their place of work for a given gas price increase. And so I'm going to wrap up now with just some policy implications and to kind of give you a sense of where we're hoping to head with some of this work. So what we've really shown here is that these shifts in fundamental socioeconomic drivers of land development can and have avoided sizable losses in forest and agricultural lands. But there's nothing in the paper that suggests that this is going to be permanent, right? So these are potentially temporary changes. But it's worth thinking about from kind of a land use planning standpoint. Optimal conservation theory and strategy is really about spatial targeting and timing. So in the sense that our results point to a temporary decline in development, at a minimum, they may be providing more time for land managers to enact more permanent forms of conservation. Okay, and a related issue here that we're starting to work on now is how these slowdowns are capitalized into land markets, right? So we know a lot about how development pressure boosts the value of forest and agricultural land, but we really don't know a whole lot about how quickly land markets react and adjust to changes in development patterns. Okay, and so we have a national land transaction database that we're using to look at this now under the same research grant. And there are kind of obvious implications here for the valuation of conservation easements. And from a climate policy perspective, so we've really shown that gas price changes, gas price increases can reduce land development, especially in those areas with higher commuting costs. So previous literature on gas price changes has found that increases will decrease how much you drive, not surprisingly, reduce housing starts, which is somewhat related, again, to our findings here, and reduce suburban housing prices. Now, I think our estimates here kind of point to an underappreciated aspect of carbon pricing or carbon taxes. Okay, so carbon pricing would make people consume less gasoline, okay, it would incentivize them to do that. But there's also going to be this indirect effect that we find on land development. Okay, and so this is going to avoid both current emissions from irreversibly converting, say, forest land to developed uses, as well as lost future sequestration potential. And so we're taking our estimates here, our land use change estimates now, and we're tying them in with some more detailed forest stand data to think about, what were the extent of these avoided emissions from this change in development? Because I think this is kind of an underappreciated aspect of climate policy, or what a potential climate policy would do. And then one of the things that I just want to hit on that some of you may have noticed that we don't explicitly account for is land use regulations. So some of those state trend parameters they're consistent with states that have more comprehensive land use regulations, having a slower land development growth rate. But we can't really say anything explicit about this because there is no national longitudinal data on land use regulations that's available, right? There are certain things at kind of more local levels, but there's nothing that gives us kind of a consistently measured national geographic scope, which we would need for this paper. But that's really an area where future data work and data compilation efforts would be extremely fruitful. And then last, so what about the pandemic, right? What about this thing that's affected all of us over the past 2 or 3 years? So there's kind of a tension here. So on the one hand, you have this rise in remote work and a lot of speculation that this is leading people to relocate. Okay, they're moving to an area where they want to live because they no longer have to live in an area that's close to their place of work. Now, I said that's speculation because the fact remains that between 2000 and 2021, we actually had in the US the lowest moving rate in the last 70 years. But to the extent that remote work becomes more permanent, we could see something like commuting costs becoming less salient in people's minds as they think about where they may want to relocate. But at the same time, of course, we have these really high gas prices right now. And if those stay persistently high and remote work doesn't become kind of a permanent feature of the US labor market, or to the extent that it doesn't, this would also act to incentivize denser development. So in general, it's still obviously playing out, but this is something that I'm interested to see moving forward. And it's kind of a story, definitely a story to watch. Okay, so that's going to do it for our presentation. I've got the full citation to the paper here. And then I have both my Montana and Oregon State email addresses here, and I'll be starting at Oregon State in August. So, I'd be more than happy to entertain any questions anyone has now or in the future. But thank you for listening, and yeah, thanks, Xander.
Yeah, no, it's great, and we got a dedicated audience when you put up the long equation. I think that would have scared off less hardy participants. So feel free, you can unmute yourself and ask a question out loud, or you can type it in the chat window. And I understand if people have other meetings to get to, if you need to drop off. I find this fascinating, so I'm going to ask a question or two myself. I guess as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the current situation, and you in your last point sort of answered some of the questions that were brewing, and I guess one thing you didn't mention looking forward, unless I missed it, was that the US population, the rate of growth, I mean, it's still growing, but it's, I think 2001 or 2021 had the lowest population growth in, a long time, maybe. But that, it doesn't seem like that is as big a driver as some of these other things. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's a really good point. The kind of slowdown in population that we've seen, really recently, from, I think that's the 2020 census. Yeah, so that would of course put downward pressure on land development. Another thing I think too is housing prices, right? So there's a lot more. It just seems like everywhere, everyone you talk to in any city or town throughout the country is talking about how high housing prices are, and that's due to a variety of things, supply shortages, and kind of slowdowns in the construction industry. Are something you often hear about that. But yeah, I think both of those things would serve to kind of decrease new development moving forward, just both because there's maybe a small decrease in the population change that we've seen prior to these fairly recent years, and then also the fact that new housing is becoming increasingly less affordable for a lot of families.
I guess another factor that maybe is more future work, from a forestry perspective, the spatial pattern of conversion is really important, because if you have, sort of a forested area and like one house kind of in the middle of it, it can break up the ability to do, say, a harvest across the whole area. Or, another thing that's been documented is as people move into more rural areas, they can sort of cause changes around sort of ability to cut trees, essentially, road restrictions, or just complaints about, you're getting mud on the road, or we don't like the way it looks, or something. And so there's kind of this shadow effect of a development, and then around it maybe a reduction in the possibility of conducting forest management. So I'm wondering if that sort of spatial pattern, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but it seems like that wasn't really the focus of your work.
Yeah, so as far as forest management practices go, we don't really, like you said, speak to that at all. But yeah, I suppose you'd have to look at things like county level timber output as a function of new development or something like that. But that's a really interesting question, and definitely something that sounds like something someone should be working on.
There's an interesting paper from North Carolina that looked at just that sort of, I think, county or smaller level, and as development sort of, and I think there was even a threshold effect as the sort of housing per square mile or people per square mile hit a certain level, the amount of timber harvest dropped, just because it's more complicated as parcels get smaller, and there's sort of some pressure. Some folks moving in don't like timber harvest, bottom line.
Right. And there are obvious kind of access issues. And,
yeah.
Productive timber stands becoming stranded and not, being inaccessible. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I've been talking a lot here. I know we're at time, so people probably have to leave, but if anybody wants to unmute, feel free. I see some folks have run off to other things. Okay, trying to give people a chance to unmute here. This is fascinating work, and I think your points about giving sort of forest protection, conservation work a little time is a good one. Although current gas prices, I think, certainly I know locally it's definitely driving people to live, closer to town. Because even if you're not commuting to work, you got to get to the grocery store, and suddenly it's costing you $5. So I don't know how long that'll last, but at least in the short term, it's a factor. Great. Well, Sarah looks like she's unmuted. Sarah, do you want to chime in with a question?
Sure. This was really interesting, and I appreciate you touching on the sort of speculation about what the pandemic might do, because I was for sure that was on my mind too. I guess I have two questions. We look a lot at FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis data from the Forest Service, and I have to say that a lot of the trends that we see in terms of forest loss are concerning and are definitely different than past decades. And so I wonder if you can speak at all to the relationship between FIA data and some of your findings, if you know about that. And then the second part, and this is a little bit, I think on your mind too, Xander, is that, in the forest sector, we're sort of looking at these trends, and we understand that this is not being driven by the forest industry. And yet the loss, deforestation really is a key element of sustainability requirements, and something that the sector is really trying to navigate, but also feels powerless around. And so I don't know if you can offer any recommendations on this, because I feel like just in terms of is there better research that we can do relative to the value of working forests, or are there specific regulatory levers that we might be able to pull to be able to really sort of look at these trends and better understand them relative to what we can in the forest sector do? Those are big questions, but that's the $100 million question that all of us are wrestling with every day.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. So I guess for the first question, I am personally not intimately familiar with the FIA. That's actually what we're using to try to look at some of these avoided emissions from avoided development. And that's through Chris Mehiar, who's one of the co-authors on this paper. He's at the Forest Service. So I don't want to say anything about how development is defined in the FIA versus the NRI, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit, to look a little bit more at how it's defined in those two data sources. As far as a broader sustainability angle on this, I suppose, again, that's a big question. Things like conservation easements, right, are probably going to be more effective in general, in my opinion, because they tend to be permanent. And if they allow for, working timber harvest, working forestry practices, those are going to be more effective than something like, say, use value assessment, which is temporary, right? You're only going to get preferential tax treatment up until the land is no longer in forest use. And maybe kind of highlighting some of the additional secondary benefits of things like conservation easements that I think a lot of people might not necessarily appreciate, how they tend to have in general a positive effect on nearby property values. How one thing I hear a lot about from certain elements of certain branches, ideologies of policymakers, is that conservation easements reduce tax revenue, which is really just not true as long as we have use value assessment, right? That development component of the forest land value wasn't being taxed to begin with. So that's kind of, not really a valid argument that I think a lot of people just kind of make offhand who tend to be against things like easements. And then also the fact that they can actually spur investment, right? Do conservation easements, are you just giving someone, a lump sum tax break that they're gonna buy a new boat with, or are they actually using it to invest in their operation and make the changes that they need in order for them to be more competitive in kind of an urbanizing environment? So I'm not sure that directly addresses your question, but from a policy standpoint, that's kind of how a couple quick thoughts.
No, that's great. And I'm sort of remembering back, you spoke to the fact that the current work that you're presenting didn't really include land use planning restrictions or land use policy. So it feels like there is sort of a little bit of an unanswered question about, and I think probably some existing research on this, but how effective is sort of growth constraint policy on land use change, right? Like that.
Yeah. I actually do just a shameless self-citation, but I do have an older paper with some of my former colleagues at Oregon State and from when I was in grad school and other people as well, that looks at how urban growth boundaries affected forest disturbance. And we do tend to find that they had a positive effect in terms of alleviating forest disturbance. So yeah, that's I guess one additional related point.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we should probably wrap it up here. I could talk about this all day. This is, as Sarah pointed out, this is really kind of a crucial nexus as we think beyond like day-to-day work in a particular woodlot to forestry in general. Keeping forests as forests is just fundamental. And so anything we can do to think through that, and you did throw out some good ideas. Yeah, really important stuff. So as you continue working, I guess soon at Oregon State, stay in touch, and as ideas come up, I think there's a waiting audience.
Yeah, thanks again, Xander, for having me. Thanks to everyone for listening. This was great. Yeah, thanks appreciate the opportunity.
And we'll share the recording. I missed the very beginning, but I think actually we got what we needed. We'll share the recording, and so if you want to review something, I think there are parts that I may need to listen to twice or share with a colleague. That'll be on the Guild webpage relatively soon. So, well,
the beginning was where I botched the PowerPoint anyway.
Yeah, so we skipped that part. So yeah, it's all good.
Fantastic.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Yeah, thanks again.